Well, it's the Friday 13th edition, as I said earlier at the start of the show. That's been unlucky for France, downgraded to the same level as the U.S. And we've got financial expert and the head of Euro-Pacific Capital, Peter Schiff, joining us. He's also one of the advisors to Ron Paul on Ron Paul's economic policies. And he joins us today to talk about the state of the U.S. economy, the world economy, give us his take on what possible war with Iran could mean and what he sees developing, his prognosis for 2012. Peter, great to have you here with us.
Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Wow, so much happening. Out of the gates, Ron Paul.
Well, he's doing good. Look, he's got a lot of momentum coming into South Carolina. I think I'm headed down there myself for the debates next week, but came in first place in New Hampshire. He's only one of two candidates to actually finish in the money in both those early primaries. He came in third in Iowa and second in New Hampshire. So other than Mitt Romney, no other candidates finished in the top three both times. So there's a lot to his candidacy that the media continues to overlook.
Do you think it's backfiring on the dinosaur media that they continue to say he can't win, but that he, like a salmon, is swimming upstream against that tide?
Maybe. Maybe there's some rebellion in there. The more the establishment tells us he can't win, maybe the more the anti-establishment mood wants to go towards Ron Paul. And this, is going to be an anti-establishment type election. The country is in a lot of trouble because of establishment type candidates. And that's really all you've got now in the Republican field. Other than Ron Paul, it's business as usual. And even if it means that, we don't have Barack Obama, even if one of the other Republicans can beat Obama, how are they any different than George Bush? And, so we got into this trouble with Bush, at the helm. We're not going to get out of it with, one of his surrogates. We need to have somebody that actually understands the problem and is going to take a different approach. And the only one who would do that would be Ron Paul.
Peter, let me throw a curveball at you. Let's say that people woke up, there was an election fraud, Ron Paul won the nomination, beat Obama, knowing his economic policies because you helped him develop them. What do you think would happen if he actually got in? Because the power structure obviously wouldn't even, let him overnight try to change things. What would we expect him to do to try to change course?
Well, first of all, if Ron Paul actually won the White House, those votes wouldn't be cast in a vacuum. I would imagine a lot of other sympathetic candidates who would also be running in the House would be elected with him. So he would probably have more help. And really all he needs is a third of the House to be with him, because then he can veto almost everything. And, Congress can't spend money if they can't override his veto. So he would have a lot of power to rein in government as the president if he can just get a little bit of cooperation out of Congress. And if he's going to get elected president, people are going to be voting for congressmen, too, that might be sympathetic. I think it's interesting. We just got the minutes from the Federal Reserve going back to 2006, showing that nobody at the Federal Reserve had any idea that a financial crisis was coming, that there was a problem in the housing market. I had just finished writing my book, How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. So I knew it was coming. I know Ron Paul knew it was coming. He was warning Ben Bernanke. He was warning Alan Greenspan that this crisis was coming. So we got to get rid of the people who know nothing about economics, nothing about finance, and put somebody in place who actually understands these problems, because otherwise we're never going to solve them.
Well, well put. With the captains we have running things now, more and more, here's a headline out of Forbes, the worst economic recovery since the Great Depression. They're calling it the greatest recession. From your research, what is the real state of the U.S. and world economy? And on the current course, where are we going?
Well, the U.S. is a disaster. We're not recovering from anything. We are temporarily getting some phony GDP improvement because we're borrowing money and spending it. We got our trade deficit came out today for November, moved up 10%, almost at $50 billion for the month of November. Spending more borrowed money on imports is how we got into trouble. And all we're doing now is buying time with borrowed money. The thing that's propping up the U.S. economy is all the problems in the rest of the world. I mean, somehow we're benefiting from the fact that there's so many problems in Europe that by default people are simply buying dollars in treasuries, even though we actually have more problems than Europe. It's just that nobody is worried about our problems yet. And so we benefit from Europe's problems because we can borrow even more money cheaper. But we have to remember the reason Europe got into trouble is because they borrowed too much money and now they can't pay it back and interest rates are rising. Well, we've borrowed more. We can't pay it back either. And when interest rates finally rise in America, we're even more vulnerable to that than Europe is now.
Obviously, nobody can tell exactly the month, the day, the week when things start to, really unravel faster from just this slow devaluation of global currencies. But undoubtedly, we're going down a very dangerous road. Something big is happening, as Ron Paul has said. What will it look like as things basically unravel?
Well, no one knows for sure, but I mean, you can look at some of the riots that we saw in Greece or in Ireland when the governments try to make even trivial cuts in benefits. The truth is that we need much more substantial cuts in Europe than the ones that the rioters were protesting. So think about how it's going to be in the United States. We have an entire nation of dependents. We have so many people who think they're entitled to something from somebody else. And when the truth comes out that the government has made a bunch of promises that they can't keep and the government has to fess up, a lot of people are going to be pretty pissed. And so it's going to be a very difficult environment. There's going to be a lot of upheaval. I think it's going to be not just the very peaceful protests that we saw with Occupy Wall Street. I think it's going to be on a much bigger scale. And I think the media, particularly the Democrats, keep feeding this class envy, this vilification of capitalism, of the 1%. And I think when things really get bad, tempers could really heat up, especially if it means that, we're waiting in lines to get gasoline or to buy food because there's so much inflation and the government has price supports, that you can't get those things. I mean, tempers could really heat up and people are going to be looking for someone to blame. And unfortunately, they might not blame the government. They might blame the people who they perceive to be the threat in the private sector. And that's going to be a very scary situation.
Well, they are making it an us against them system, like the general population against Wall Street, and George Soros and others and Obama tried to cast that as anybody making money, anybody who's a capitalist is bad, when really it's three groups. You've got the big dependent groups, then you've got those, that just want to work in the free market, and then you've, the rich, the poor, all in between. And then you've got the crony capitalists, as you know, who do work with government, and they're trying to scapegoat capitalism in the free market, knowing that it's going to boomerang and they're going to use this giant dependent class to once and for all overturn what's left of the free market and transfer it to a planned economy. How do you translate that nuanced crisis we face to a general public who, on average, there's two Americas. There's folks that do know it's about working hard, but there are a lot of people, believe me, I got a lot of employees as well, not as many as you, who really sometimes think that they are entitled to everything.
Yeah, well, first of all, we already have an economy with a lot of central planning. I mean, they don't plan everything, but they plan a lot. I mean, the government wants us buying houses, and so they tweak the laws to encourage us to do that. There are a lot of things the government tries to micromanage with the tax codes, with what it chooses to subsidize and what it chooses to penalize and how the regulations are. So we've already moved in that direction, and that's a big part of the problem. We need to have more market forces at play to have a more effective allocation of resources. I forgot the other part of your question.
Well, no, it's just how do we communicate to people that don't understand capitalism that getting rid of it doesn't work anywhere in the world? I
remember, and it's also, it's not just Wall Street. You've got, look, General Motors and Chrysler, they're not Wall Street. They got government bailouts. So a lot of it is Wall Street and the banks. But the problem isn't that Wall Street bankers accepted bailout money, because anyone is going to accept money. If the government is giving away money, you're going to line up to get your share. I don't blame the institutions or the individuals for taking money that the government is handing out. I blame the government for being in a position to hand it out in the first place.
Exactly. If you didn't have the government power to have that big auction, you wouldn't have the feeding frenzy in there.
Of course, so you got to go after the government. You can't just go after Wall Street, because that's a symptom of the bigger issue. The problem is the government. And yes, Wall Street is buying off the politicians, but that's because the politicians are for sale. But we put them in that situation. We gave them the stuff to sell and the ability to do it. We got to take the power away from the politicians. That's what we need to protest, and understand that the problems are emanating from Washington. That's the source of all the problems. And until we take care of that, it doesn't matter what we do. We're just tinkering around the edges, or we're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We're still going to sink unless we get to the fundamental seaworthiness of the ship and take care of that. Right? You got to go to the actual problem. You want to kill the snake, right? You cut off the head, and it's in Washington D.C. It's not on Wall Street.
Well, sure, if government wasn't, 40% of the economy or whatever now it is, or controlling 40% or more, then there wouldn't be this big auction. And that's right. It's why Wall Street goes there, and it's allowed now these big, mega titans to form. That it's a very sick situation. Obviously, though, for now, people are starting to listen to what you and many others have talked about, but it hadn't gotten to the policy level yet. If they don't start correcting things, what will happen?
Well, look, eventually we're going to have a huge financial crisis. I mean, people think, what do you mean eventually? We just had it. We just had to warm up. I mean, we had, the overture of the opera. I mean, believe me, it's going to get a lot worse, because everything we did to solve the problem solved nothing. It compounded the problem. We've delayed some of the pain, but the pain is going to be far more agonizing now because of what we did. I mean, we are going to have a collapse in the bond market and or the currency market, or, and when that happens, it's going to be very painful for average Americans. I mean, right now, if you still have a job, the U.S. economy, it's not that bad, right? But, we get a collapse of the dollar, we get runaway inflation. Having a job is not going to be much of a consolation if your paycheck doesn't buy anything. So things are going to get very bad very fast when this thing starts to unravel. And all it takes is the world to figure out that, that this whole thing is an illusion, that inflation is a lot worse than the Fed maintains, and that the Fed is powerless to do anything about it without toppling the U.S. economy, because they can't raise interest rates. We have got so much debt right now that any kind of increase in interest rates to even levels that would be historically low. I mean, right now they're historically, ridiculously low. But if we just went back to a historically low level of interest rates, we're too broke to afford it, let alone normal interest rates or the high interest rates that ultimately we're going to have to live with. So in order to avoid that, the Fed is keeping interest rates as low as possible, but that is screwing up the economy more and more, because we go deeper into debt. We take all those free drugs and we use them because they're free. But meanwhile, we build up a bigger problem because of that. And ultimately, when we got to go cold turkey, which we're going to have to do if we want to avoid the death by overdose, it's going to be that much more difficult. So it is going to be a real crisis. That was a small one, and the government was able to bail people out right during the last crisis. There's not going to be any bailouts in the real crisis, because the government is going to be failing too. Who's going to bail out the U.S. government? Nobody. There's nobody there who's capable of doing it.
And if the U.S. actually goes down publicly in a hard crash, can you imagine the confidence destroying shockwaves that's going to have, and the bedlam that is going to break out from that?
Oh, yeah. And, as I said, there's only two choices. Either we have massive inflation that destroys the economy, or we avoid the massive inflation with big increases in interest rates, and that destroys the economy. But there's no way around it. At least if we destroy the economy without destroying the dollar, then we can rebuild a viable one. Because what we have now has to be destroyed eventually, because it's an abomination. It's not a real, genuine economy. All we're doing is borrowing money and spending it on stuff, and that's not viable in the long run. So the sooner we can address these problems, the better. But, it's not going to be easy to do it. We have to atone